Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we got another great episode here for you for some more Kentucky history. Joining me today is a special guest, Caleb Franz. He is a writer, nonprofit professional, and author of The Conductor, The Story of Reverend John Rankin, Abolitionism, Central Founding Father. His book is coming out in October through the Post Hill Press, and he often provides commentary on public affairs and writes on American history. His work has appeared in outlets such as The Independent, the Louisville Courier Journal. I about said the Courier Journal. That's a little history for you. The Real Clear History, and more. He lives with his wife in Lexington, Kentucky. Franz, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm excited to have this conversation. It is definitely something that has been fairly overlooked in the story of John Rankin. Those who know who John Rankin is or are aware of his story, the Kentucky elements are certainly it's certainly something that's largely overshadowed or overlooked. So I'm excited to dig into it.
All right. Well, that sounds good. Well, Caleb, before we get too much into old John, let's tell us a little bit about your Kentucky connection and so forth.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in a town called Ironton, Ohio. If you may be familiar with, it's right
across the
in that
river.
tri-state area with Ashland, Kentucky, and Huntington, West Virginia. So I had grown up basically right across the river from Kentucky throughout my entire upbringing, and now I of course live in Lexington. I lived in Louisville for a little bit before then as well, but there has been such a rich history that I've always been so fascinated with. History has always sort of been the subject that I've gravitated towards the most, and it's one that I'm fascinated with storytelling and the ability of what story has to sort of capture on the imagination of people and the way it can sort of dictate or determine the trajectory of history, and that is certainly the case with Kentucky history. So the stories of Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton and all of that has always been very near and dear to me growing up, and little did I know that I had such a hero that I didn't realize that John Rankin himself, the subject of the conversation here, he was a minister and an abolitionist, and he actually died in my hometown in Ironton, Ohio. And the more that I sort of discovered him, the more I realized that his story was one that was not just undertold, but potentially, I think he's one of America's greatest heroes that has been more or less lost to history. So I determined that this was the story that I needed to tell.
Yeah. Well, that's very true, and that's one thing the podcast is trying to do as well, is tell those stories of the people of Kentucky. I'm with a little bias, of course. Those stories that people have forgotten, and that are very impactful throughout not only Kentucky history but American history as well. I'm going to throw out one of my favorite Kentuckians is John G. Fee. Which
John Fee is a great Kentuckian, and a great admirer of John Rankin's as well.
Yeah. So we might have a little parallel. We did an episode on John G. Fee. Geez, it's been a long time. A few, maybe one of our first first year of podcasts, we probably covered John G. Fee. But he's these people just they get forgotten, man,
Mhm.
and they're very important. You mentioned Daniel Boone, and everybody knows Daniel Boone. But
Sure.
then you throw out Simon Kenton, like he's just as important.
Mhm.
Um, and the list goes on and on and on. So you kind of started off a little bit with how you got started on this, what your motives and so forth were. But let's just dive into Reverend Rankin here and talk a little bit more about, I mean, I guess his upbringing, where he got started, and why he is so important.
Yeah, so John Rankin, the Rankin family was they came over to Eastern Tennessee, and if you know anything about that part of Tennessee, it was kind of a pocket of abolitionist activity in the early part of American history. And certainly some of that had a profound effect and a profound influence on John Rankin. He eventually determined that he was going to become a minister, to go to seminary and go to he was a Presbyterian minister. And eventually he kind of ruffled some feathers in Tennessee because he was also an anti-slavery man, and that was not something that a lot of the congregation or the elders in Eastern Tennessee, still being a slave state, wanted to hear. So he was kind of forced to leave. He not necessarily forced, but he determined that that was the best peaceful route to continue his abolitionism and to continue the ministry in the way that he thought he needed to. As he moved up through Kentucky, he was originally going to just go straight for Ohio, but a few external elements and
Mhm.
as well as a few both positive and negative external elements and internal um, developments caused him to stay in Kentucky for 4 years before he eventually completed his journey to Ripley, Ohio. Now, Kentucky's part in John Rankin's story, as far as like when he lived there, is admittedly a very small part compared to when you look at Tennessee. He grew up there, so the first 18 to 20 years of his life, and then of course in Ohio he lived in Ripley until shortly after the Civil War. So 4 years doesn't seem like much in the long scheme of things. However, those 4 years were arguably the most foundational and the most important to build upon the man who he would eventually become known as, the abolitionist that he would eventually become known as, the preacher he would eventually become known as, and it gave him the tools and the honestly the confidence to do all that he was able to accomplish throughout his life.
Yeah. Wow. And again, I don't want to make the point again, but the Kentucky part is very important. Uh, um, and so while he was in Kentucky, you talk about those roots and so forth. Really, I mean, was it the you know I guess what really drove him or got him settled in or gave him that foundation?
Yeah.
I guess.
So he made his way up. He traveled through Lexington on his journey, and eventually made his way to Paris. And he called upon a minister in Paris who pointed him in the direction of Carlisle. And that was they were in need of a pastor at it was the Concord Church in Carlisle, Kentucky. And uh, John was a bit hesitant at first. He was kind of anxious to go and complete his journey to Ohio, but he eventually relented, and part of it was out of necessity. His horse kind of collapsed underneath him from exhaustion of the journey, so he kind of took that as a sign from God and said, "Well, I'm this has to be for a reason. So I suppose I'll stick around and see where this leads." Initially, he was just going to do a few services, But winter was approaching. The horse, of course, was still recovering, and his firstborn son, was still an infant, basically, still very young. So he determined that he would stick around for 6 months at the Concord Church, and that was what he agreed to. Well, during these 6 months, he really sort of realized his own limitations.
Mhm.
At the time, whenever he kind of got started in his ministry, he was a more or less a traveling preacher. He would have like a handful of sermons that he would pull from, and then and provide them to various audiences, but it would never be the same place at the same sermon at the same time. This was a little different. He had never like pastored a
Yeah.
church before. So it kind of made him realize that maybe he doesn't have enough juice in him to creative juices to kind of create the sermons that is necessary to go on and pastor this church. And his wife kind of talked him out of. He was getting discouraged and almost considered like, well, should I even be a minister in the first place if I can't even put together a handful of sermons for a few months. His wife eventually talked to him and said more or less that this isn't the sign to quit. This is the sign to develop yourself and sharpen yourself and grow into, for lack of better words, to grow into the man that you were destined to be. And he took that to heart, thankfully. And he decided that he was going to continue to study and continue to read, predominantly, theology, but just develop himself more. And over those 6 months, the congregation noted that he was in fact improving in his ability to preach and his ability to speak with conviction. In his autobiography early on, I should mention too, he was not a very good speaker. He talks about these preachers because he grew up in the Second Great Awakening. He talked about these preachers who would just almost seem like they were possessed with the spirit to really have this big booming voice and have all this charisma, and that just didn't exist in him. So it gave him a sense of just a lack of confidence, really. That he thought maybe he wasn't made for this, and a lot of times he would have to use like write out his entire sermon and then deliver it that way instead of just delivering it from the heart the way that a lot of other pastors would do. So this time in the 6 month period that he agreed to stay and preach at that Concord Church in Carlisle, that really made the difference between what he the kind of pastor that he had become in Tennessee versus the kind of pastor that he was entering into Ripley, Ohio. And I can't express enough how important that was for this story, because when he's entering Ripley, Ohio, Ripley is, despite the fact that Ohio obviously was a free state and it always was, Ripley was, I compare it, the term that I use in the book that I compare it to is like an old prototype saloon town of the West. It's full of like shootouts and muddy, bloody brawls in the streets. Not a gentle place. Arguably, minus slavery, the bluegrass area was far more of a pleasant location for someone like Rankin.
Mhm.
But it did give him the opportunity to kind of do a test run, basically, before going into Ripley, and gave him the confidence and the courage and the conviction to go on and eventually build up his ministry as well as his Underground Railroad activities in Ohio.
Mhm. Now, for listeners out there, Rankin was born in 1793, correct?
Yes. Yep.
And so he didn't really come to Kentucky 1820-ish, or what was the
So
time
see, he
frame?
came in 1817. So
Okay.
this like 6 month period that I'm referring to is that winter between 1817 and 1818.
Kind of right on the cusp of the antebellum era and all
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Um, well, that's really good, character building in the sense that he kind of didn't really have that. I guess you think of Martin Luther King, these
Mhm.
great orators that were just able to speak, and it shows too patience, character building as far as him becoming a better speaker, and then using that as his calling or his drive. Now we can move out of the Kentucky part. He goes to Ripley, and this sounds like some good stories are about to come from old Ripley.
Yes, you could say that again. And Kentucky is, despite the fact that we're in Ohio by the time that he
Mhm.
spends most of his life there in Ripley, Ohio, Kentucky is still a presence that is carried throughout the book, really, and throughout his story. Predominantly in Mason County, Ohio, near Maysville. These are the people and the slaveholders that in Mason County that are most infuriated with John Rankin and the ones that really become animated to action against him, and in some cases even putting bounties on his head, up to forgive me if I'm getting the number wrong, but up to $3,000 in money in that time. So this would be like the down payment for a small house in today's economy. Um, Ripley was not an easy thing to overcome, but he eventually did, and he eventually put a house on Ripley in the background of Ripley, Ohio. That's is still standing today. You can go and visit it, and as
Cool.
I did throughout the research process for the book. And the community there in Ripley today, I should mention, has done an excellent job at preserving the story and preserving Rankin's legacy. But you have a picture perfect view of Kentucky into
Mhm.
the Ohio River. So that way, that all of the slaves that were crossing the river or looking to where to escape, they could see Rankin's house from miles away,
Oh, wow.
and they would use that as a beacon, really, a beacon of liberty, a beacon of hope, that they could look at and say, "This is the house that we have to reach if we want to make it up the chain." He never lost a slave on the Underground Railroad on their journey to freedom, eventually up to Canada. And that is not an easy accomplishment because he had over 2,000 slaves pass through his station, and that is
That's a lot.
no small number, to
Yeah.
be sure.
Um, well, with geography real quick, Ripley is on the other side. What's the Kentucky side of opposite of Ripley would be what county or what are we looking at?
Yeah,
In
so it's
between.
it's Mason County. You have Maysville
Mhm.
in that area, Dover. In fact, uh, in in that area, you have probably most significantly, or the most prominent story of of a slave crossing the Underground Railroad to escape to freedom. You have the story of a character named Eliza. Now, if you are familiar with this, this is the name that Harriet Beecher Stowe gives one of her characters in the book of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was something that was very controversial at the time. Everyone was kind of like claiming that she made it all up to make slavery look like it was this really nefarious institution. Because at the time there was this image of slavery in Kentucky, where it obviously was not as bad as, say, Alabama or Mississippi,
Mhm.
but there was this kind of idea of like the benevolent slaveholder.
Mhm.
And this story kind of, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, it kind of diminishes that idea in a way that was very popular, in a way that people couldn't put down the book. And she took that story, at least that portion of the story of Eliza's crossing across the Ohio River, directly from John Rankin.
Mhm, mhm, yeah, the old, we treat our slaves well, so it's all
Right,
okay, kind of,
right,
uh, a narrative,
right,
um,
right. And that was a narrative I should mention too. What the thing that John Rankin's name really became popular, and in fact, at this time, certainly by the time that Harry Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, John Rankin had become known as the father of abolitionism, certainly in the West,
mhm.
largely. So, the West, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee,
The first
that
West.
that part of the country at the time. And he was sometimes referred to as Martin Luther in a similar vein, kind of pointing to him as the man who kind of kickstarted this all. And this is largely because of a series of letters that he had written to his brother, because his brother had recently informed him. And this was in 1824, so he had already passed through Kentucky and he's starting to settle into Ripley. Um, his brother had informed him recently, he was a merchant in Virginia, that he had purchased slaves. And this was kind of a gut punch to him. It
Mhm,
was a sense of betrayal. Not only did Rankin think that his brother was wrong, but they all grew up in the same sort of anti-slavery family. This felt like it wasn't just that you were being immoral yourself, but you were betraying everything that you had grown up to believe.
going against the
So
family.
right, yeah, exactly. So he starts this series of letters, but he doesn't send them directly to him. He has them published in the local newspaper,
Huh,
and they're a series of public letters that he doesn't really give him the chance to respond to until he's finished.
huh.
And then he mails them. He mails his brother the newspapers that comes out each week, because it was actually cheaper to send him the newspaper than it was to send it over postage. So he could kind of knock out two birds with one stone with it.
Yeah, put
And
it all
these
in.
letters become the foundation
Yeah,
of what we know of as the modern anti-slavery movement. William Lloyd Garrison goes on to describe about how these letters gripped him, and he points to John Rankin as his anti-slavery father because of these letters.
mhm,
And in these letters, there's a specific part. I believe it's like letter 3 or 4. It's somewhat early in the process, um, where he reflects on his time in Kentucky, specifically in Carlisle, where he's the minister of this church, and he points to his time a little bit, fondly, and thinking of the people that he was able to meet there. And he looks at Kentucky and says, if there's any place where slavery would be considered acceptable in any way, it probably would be in Kentucky. Now, he's not saying this because he thought that slavery was, any way acceptable with
mhm,
what he experienced there. He's saying this in a way to explain to his brother, and as well as largely the people who would be reading
mhm.
his letters at the time, because he certainly didn't anticipate that they would take off as widespread as they did. He was largely talking to um, members of Maysville on the Kentucky side, and of course Ripley on the Ohio side. And he talks about how slavery, if it were to be acceptable, it would be in Kentucky. But this, he writes, is like saying it's the tender mercies of the wicked.
Mhm.
In other words, very cruel still. And it kind of highlights how depraved the nature of slavery is. That if an institution like slavery in a state of Kentucky can be considered somewhat benign or somewhat benevolent,
Mhm.
then that just shows you how truly despicable and how truly awful it is in places like the Deep South, especially.
Yeah.
So rather than kind of giving Kentucky a pass, he's actually saying if this is the best you got, then this is a completely awful and deprived system.
Yeah. Yeah. I do, commend him for his posting his grievances on Facebook, and then and then making the phone call later.
Right. Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, it really was. He was a fortunately a very prolific writer, and specifically in the form of editorials. He wrote a lot of editorials for the Castigator, which was the paper that these letters originally appeared in. Of course, later on, whenever the Liberator came about, after Garrison helped start to form the Anti-Slavery Society. He had editorials posted in there. The Philanthropist in Cincinnati with James Burney. That was another paper that he would frequently use for his commentary, and sometimes it would get him into a little bit of trouble. But it was always something that anytime, even whenever people disagreed with him, there was a certain level of respect and a certain level of admiration that not all of the abolitionists carried. Figures like Garrison were very controversial, intentionally so. They almost reveled in being being bomb throwers, so to speak. Obviously, Garrison was nonviolent. In no way like not a John Brown or something like that. But Garrison didn't do himself any favors in trying to build bridges. And that was something that John Rankin prioritized. And in this sense, I really do try to compare him in the book to more of like a George Washington type figure, someone who is the right person for the movement to bring all the factions together and to hold the ship together until you cross the finish line. And that's essentially what he did.
yeah. So, I mean, the papers and that pretty much catapults him onto the national stage.
It does, but not immediately.
Mhm.
Actually, there was an incident of arson that burned half the copies of the first edition, and there was about 600 copies in circulation at the time, and he didn't have the money to print a second edition. So there was about a 4 to 5 year period where he just kind of thought that was that. Fortunately, they had their intended purpose, and his brother did divorce himself from slavery.
Mhm.
He had his slaves set free and eventually moved to Louisville, Kentucky, actually. But if he thought, if that was the accomplishment of it, then I'm satisfied with that. But there was a Quaker in New Jersey that got his hands on that first edition that eventually, gave it to Garrison specifically, and that individual reached out to John Rankin and asked about printing a second copy, and he said, my sole object of writing those letters was to combat against and eventually defeat the institution of slavery. And if it was going to do that, then he would give him his blessing to go ahead and print a second copy. Of course, he knew that that's. Of course, he knew that that's what that would eventually do. But I don't think he even anticipated just how far spread, because the American Anti-Slavery Society used it as basically a textbook um, for lectures, because he really took apart every possible argument that he could come across against slavery, and there were plenty of arguments about how slavery is somehow good for the slave because of the inferiority of blacks,
Mhm.
and there's arguments about how it's justified in the Bible and all sorts of things like this. And Rankin just completely rejected all of those things. And these letters, he provides a breakdown basically of each individual argument to be able to push back against that. And the anti-slavery movement used those arguments throughout its existence to combat against it.
Well, that's pretty cool that he did let him print print the second edition. And
Yeah.
um, but yeah, it's interesting whenever you have somebody, that kind of, they don't really expect it or they didn't intend to have this impact, but then it kind of blows up and they become or their um, thoughts or in his case, his sentiments, his desire becomes a big force in what would eventually lead to more people joining in the cause and so forth. Now, I bring up John G. Fee. Um, he's born a little bit later. He's a
Mhm.
little late to the cause. Um,
He
he.
was actually, if I can interrupt
Oh, go
real
ahead.
quick, whenever I was researching this, it kind of popped out to me. But he was actually born 2 months, just 2 months before John Rankin's firstborn son, Adam
Okay.
Lowry Rankin. So they would have, and I know that they actually both went to Lane Seminary as well. So they would have been kind of in the same circles.
Gotcha.
Uh, Adam Lowry and John G. Fee.
Well, that
And Fee, of course, was he admired Rankin. I believe in his autobiography, he even mentions
yeah.
Rankin by name and specifically, how he was coming over across the river from Ripley. And I think that that's just a testament to his influence in this
Mhm.
part of the country and in Kentucky.
Yeah, and Rankin or not Rankin, Fee was born in Bracken County, I believe. So
Yes.
not too far from
No,
uh,
not far at all.
um, Rankin. But like Fee endured a lot of violence, personal violence and that kind of stuff. But I mean, he was kind of in the more of the thick of it in Kentucky. Did Rankin have any sort of issues like that? I'm sure maybe threats, that kind of stuff.
He did quite a bit, actually. In Kentucky specifically, since that's what we're talking about here. Whenever he was living here toward the end of his stay in Kentucky, he was preaching or basically instructing slaves. He got the written permission from slave owners to go out and start to preach to slaves because he was concerned that that the slaves would be lost without the message of the gospel. And at first, many slave owners agreed to the terms that were set, and there was a schoolhouse that he had set up. But then, they started to get cold feet, and they started to think about, well, if they're hearing all of these messages about spiritual freedom and all the things that that the message of the gospel tends to promote, then that is not a very far jump from physical freedom and starting to break literal chains. And I think it's really important to note too that in Kentucky, certainly, in the formation of Kentucky, you kind of had this convergence of anti-slavery Virginians and aristocratic slaveholders and
Mhm.
religious dissenters, and those groups of people fought over the original Constitution, and that
Mhm.
was a very prevalent culture in the early days of Kentucky's existence. Um, and these slaveholders were obviously, most of them were Christian. And Rankin found this despicable that they would rather keep them under bondage and make sure that they had to preserve their own control, basically,
Mhm.
rather than allow them to hear about the possibility of eternal salvation. And that to him it just demonstrated the depravity of even the so-called benevolent slaveholder can be brought down to these really despicable acts because they wanted to preserve their own institution.
Mhm.
And that
Yeah.
was one instance where you were talking about instances of violence. That was one instances where eventually mobs would begin to form around these schoolhouses that Rankin would form for slaves, and eventually this would kind of carry on into Ohio. till it got to kind of a fever point in 1841, where uh, there was an actual attack on his house, a siege, where they tried to assassinate him. Slaveholders in Kentucky crossed the river, and in the middle of the night tried to they burned down his barn and started opening fire against them. Now, nobody in his family died from that instance. He actually was able to repel them, and it's
Wow.
a really cool instance of the heroes of the conductors of Ripley rushing up to rush to his defense. I start to get excited and get chills just thinking about the imagery of that. But it was a moment. I think it was a very crucial moment for him, because I think up until that point, he had always embraced nonviolent practices and had always embraced nonviolent tendencies. And he didn't really abandon that notion. But I think that in after that moment, he starts to look at the only thing that's going to defeat slavery, which is the eventual Civil War that was to
Yeah.
come 20 years later. And it was a grim picture that was starting to be painted for him. And it was certainly a change. You see a change in his tone and the way that he would write things, and you see a change in his actions. And he's a little bit more brash, a little bit more reckless after that instance. Um, Eventually, he kind of comes back to his senses. Part of that is he was just getting older,
Yeah.
and he
That
can't
happens.
put the energy like he could. But he does kind of return to form. But it's a little bit of a glimpse, almost, of a spirit of John Brown that was ever present throughout this part of the country
Mhm.
for the abolitionists, even among the most peaceful people like John Rankin.
Yeah. Now he lives a pretty long life. I mean, he dies what in 1886.
1886, yeah.
Mhm.
He lived 93 years, which, in the 1800s,
That's
that's I mean, it's nothing to scoff at today, but
yeah.
back then it's especially impressive.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to give away all the details to the book. We want people to get it and read it as well. Before we move on, where can people get the book and so forth? When, release date, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's coming out October 15th, and you can order it on Amazon, really anywhere where you get books. It's always encouraged to pre-order because that tends to boost visibility.
Mhm.
So anytime that you can order it, it'll be right on your doorstep on October 15th.
Okay, that's awesome, awesome. Now, so he obviously, when we talk about abolitionists, Civil War comes up and so forth during the Civil War time. I mean, he is in his what, 70s, 60s, 70s. Um,
60s, yeah.
what's his role? Is he kind of taking a back seat, but then, or so forth?
So this is a really good question, because it was one that I had
Mhm.
in the research process for the book. Because surprisingly, a lot of the stuff that I would find on John Rankin, um, certainly before I started writing this, was predominantly in the 30s. Um, actually had read a book recently about Daniel Boone that kind of makes this point about there's usually a decade in figures that achieve greatness, that kind of define
Mhm.
their greatness, and everything before is just build up to that, and everything after is just kind of uh, a reaction to that decade. And you kind of see that a little bit with John Rankin in the 30s,
Mhm.
the 1830s. But the Civil War period, I thought, this can't be that he just decided to stop being active.
Mhm.
It didn't make sense to me, because a lot of the figures, even they would go into the 40s a little bit, and the 50s a little bit, but the closer it got to the Civil War, the less information I could find.
Mhm.
At least that was popularized.
Mhm.
So I did have to do some digging. And fortunately, I was able to find, and in a very John Rankin-esque fashion, it came in the form largely of editorials. I found three particular editorials. Obviously, he can only do so much. He's rapidly advancing in age, and by the time the Civil War is happening, now his sons did fight in the Civil War. Um, uh, Richard Calvin Rankin, who was not his oldest son, it was I believe his third oldest son at the time, third or fourth. He was a captain in the Civil War, and he actually fought battles against John Hunt Morgan
Oh, wow.
during the Civil War. But Rankin himself, he remained in Ripley, and he wrote three particular letters, three particular editorials. The first one was one that kind of highlights the reaction of the abolitionists to encourage President Lincoln to wage a war against against slavery itself.
Yeah.
And he was kind of joining the choir of abolitionists, saying that slavery is the reason for the war, and it has to be the purpose that the Union wages it.
Mhm.
So you see this right after the Battle of Bull Run too, which is the first like really major. Whenever everyone kind of realized we're in for the long run with this. The second that I highlight in the Civil War portion of his story is shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation,
Mhm.
and that is kind of a nice transition from the first editorial, because John Rankin is thrilled to hear about this, and he's of course celebratory, but he offers a word of caution, um, to not forget that there's still work to be done, because obviously the Emancipation Proclamation only affected those states in rebellion. It did not touch anything in Kentucky, for instance, where he
Mhm.
was still predominantly active. And throughout the Civil War, even he was still active on the Underground Railroad. And then the final editorial I found is, it kind of ties a nice bow to it. It's shortly after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and
Oh,
he continues to look forward and says, this has been accomplished, but there's still work to be done to achieve full to achieve full equality, and
mhm.
to make sure that all of God's children are seen in equal footing in the
Wow.
way that He would have wanted it to.
Mhm. Wow, that is that is pretty great that he even is well, you got that. I mean, not closure, but even in that sense, like he's able to see it through, and he is also still leading the charge forward, keeping people focused on the end goal. That's cool. Where did you find those at, or where'd you get them as far as your research?
In the Union Township Library in Ripley, Ohio.
Okay.
They were a really, I mean, they've digitized a lot of their records now. Some of the earlier research was well before any of that, so I don't blame them if they did miss any of this. But it is, I think it was something that was sort of driving me to find that, because it was very odd to me that so
Yeah.
little had been written about his Civil War years, despite the fact that the primary object of his life was becoming accomplished,
Yeah.
which was the abolition of slavery.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Everybody wants to take a victory lap of some sort and say like, "Hey,
Right,
this is
exactly,
good."
exactly. Well, I will say, also, kind of continuing on to that process of discovery. He was also very active toward the end of his life, and he, as I alluded to in the first part of this discussion, he died in the hometown that I grew up in Ironton, Ohio, and he spent most of his later days kind of um, in missionary mode, or trying to revive old churches. He also paints a kind of an interesting story toward the end of his autobiography, about going to Washington D.C. and calling on Grant after after the Civil War is over, whenever Grant recently becomes president. Grant was a student of John Rankin's back right before he went to West Point. And he in Grant's memoirs, he writes about this kind of in passing. He doesn't mention John Rankin specifically in that, but he was at Rankin's school, because Rankin had a school in Ripley, and you can just kind of see the pride that he has that one of his students is now the president of the United States, and that's a really I think a really great moment that kind of encompasses that he was a force to be reckoned with, but he was also very human, and it's one of those moments that kind of allows us to remember that.
Yeah, that is a pretty cool connection. Not that Rankin didn't have something to be honored by or known for, but hey, teaching the to be president is still pretty cool.
And not just any president, the one that also saved the Union.
I didn't even think about that part either. It's even bigger.
Two birds and one stone, right there.
Yeah. Well, again, before we get off here, remind people how to get to the book, get in contact with you, and so forth if they want more information and all that.
Sure. Yeah. So the book again is called "The Conductor: The Story of Reverend John Rankin, Abolitionism's Essential Founding Father." It's available wherever you get your books: Barnes and Noble, Amazon. And you can reach out to me on Twitter or X, or however you want to describe it. I'm not really active on that these days, but that's just my name, at Caleb Franz.
Okay, and you don't need to be active on that anyway.
Mostly for book promotion at this.
There you go.
Yeah,
and we'll put a link to the description, or in the description as well, so make it as easy as possible. Once it's officially out and so forth, and the pre-order and all that, so you can get it as soon as it comes out. Caleb, we really appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us about this. Again, somebody who had a brief time in Kentucky, but really life was very much involved in Kentucky's history and so forth, especially on the Underground Railroad and his time and his influences as well. So really covers a lot.
Yeah, if just to close that thought as well, I really think that Kentucky was an area that he truly wished that he could have stayed in if it weren't for slavery. I think that he the way that he writes about it, and the way that he kind of reflects on his years, he saw himself as a Southerner in the North, and he never let go of that. And he never kind of let go of hope for the South and for Kentucky, and of course his original home in Tennessee as well. That always had such a crucial role in his story, and you can see it carry through all the way.
Yeah. Well, if you want to get the whole picture of that story, don't forget to get Caleb's book. Again, thank you for coming on. And if nothing else, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.